Welcome to LSI training for SWAN Portal version 3. This is training module 2, in which we will cover creating a new child record and updating existing records. A child search must be initiated prior to entering any child information. We saw some of this in training module 1, and we'll cover in more detail in this module. When searching for a child record, there are 3 situations that an LSI paralegal might encounter. Those are illustrated in the workflow chart that we see here. If we search for a child record and that child is not found in the portal, we must create a new child record by selecting an Enter LSI Activities transaction. Once that is complete and the child record exists, we can move forward with entering our LSI activities. We will cover this process in detail shortly. When we find that a child record is already in the portal, there are 2 different situations we may encounter. If there is already an Enter LSI Activities transaction completed, meaning that this child has had previous SWAN LSI paralegal involvement, we will simply move forward to the child's record, where we can review for any missing or incomplete data, and move forward with entering our LSI activities. In the rare instance where we may encounter a child's record in the portal that does not have an Enter LSI Activities transaction, we will need to create one. We will also cover that process here. To access the child search function from the home screen, we have 2 options. We can click Child in the left side navigation panel, or the Child Search button in our Quick Links menu. This will open up the child search function and the fields where we can enter data for which our search will be conducted. Today we'll be searching for a child by the name of Fred Flintstone. As mentioned in training module 1, you can search a child by entering data into any of the fields outlined in red. But remember that if you are searching by name, you must enter at least 1 letter for both the first and last name. Another tip is that we don't want to specify an agency of custody or involvement. We want to make sure that we are searching for the entire state to see if this child has had any previous LSI or SWAN involvement. So best practice would be to leave the agency tab set to all. We've entered Fred's first and last name, and we'll simply click the search button to the top right. We will have to scroll down to view search results, but as we can see, there are none. We get the message, no data available in table. This means that a record does not currently exist for the child, and there is no reason to believe that they have had prior LSI involvement. From here, we can move forward with creating a new child record. To the left of the search button, we see the Create New Child button. We will click that button, which will provide us a drop-down, which for LSI paralegals should only have 1 option, and that is Enter LSI Activities. So just a note about terminology. Clicking this button will not allow us to enter LSI activities. What it will do is allow us to create a transaction which is named an Enter LSI Activities transaction. This takes us to the Start Transaction screen, where the user will be moved through a series of steps where we will enter required information to create the child record. It is best to move through these different sections in order. However, you can jump between them by clicking the tabs labeled at the top of the screen. We see Section 1 is Demographics, 2 is Agencies, 3 Address, 4 Statuses, and 5 is Siblings. In the demographics screen, there are 4 requirements, which are outlined to the left of the field in red. These are the last name, first name, date of birth, and gender. The gender selected should be that which matches the gender on the child's birth certificate. From here, we will click Next, which will take us to the next section of our entry. In the Agencies tab, we are required to select an agency. This would be the agency with which the child is involved. It does not necessarily mean that the agency has or needs to have physical and legal custody of the child at this time. We also have an option to enter a location or office and a caseworker. These are not required fields, but if you do have that information, it should be entered. Clicking Next takes us to the third section, which is Address. Please make a note here that the LSI paralegal is not responsible for knowing the address or entering that information into the tab. You will simply ignore this selection and click Next to move on to statuses. Our fourth section is statuses. Here we can enter any and all appropriate statuses as applies to the child's case. However, for the creation of the child record, only the date of initial LSI involvement, labeled initial LSI, is required. Please make note that the date of this status will default to the current date, so you should change it if applicable. At the onset of a case, you may or may not have access to some of these other status dates. Anything you are aware of should be entered at this point, however, because if it is not entered, it will not be able to be updated and will have to be added later by adding a new LSI activities transaction. This will be covered in subsequent modules. Once the initial LSI date and any other applicable statuses have been entered, we will click Next at the bottom of the page. Section 5 is the siblings section. From here, we can link this child's record to those of any siblings, which will allow for easier entry of LSI activities in the future. The sibling link function is covered in detail in Training Module 3, so we will not address it at this time, but move forward as if this particular child does not have siblings, simply clicking Next. After moving through Section 5, which is our final section, we will see a review screen where we can see all of the information we've entered for the different sections now locked in so that they cannot be changed or deleted. Once we have checked and are certain that all of this information is correct to the best of our knowledge, we will click Next to submit this transaction. Please note that without clicking Next, your transaction is not submitted and the child record will not be created. After clicking Next from the review screen and submitting the Enter LSI Activities transaction, we are taken directly to the LSI Activities page of the child's record. From here, we can enter LSI activity by clicking the Create New LSI Activity button to the top right. This process will be covered in detail in Training Module 4. Next to the child's name, to the right of it, there is a gray hyperlink labeled Child Record. By clicking on this hyperlink, we can go to the child record overview screen. Here we can see the child info window to the left, which summarizes all of the information we've previously entered about the child. To the right, we see the activity window, which will enter any transactions or activities that have been entered. Here we see our Enter LSI Activities transactions entered today, July 25th. And if we scroll down, we will see the services window, and in here would appear any services which have been referred or are ongoing for the child. At this time, of course, there are none because this is a new child record. Now we will talk about how we interact with a child record that already exists. In this case, we will be searching for the record of Bart Simpson. Again, we'll have to scroll down to view our results. And I am looking for Bart Simpson in Delaware County. So this first result in our list, I will click the hyperlinked last name to open the child record overview page. Let's talk about some of the hyperlinks on this page and what they will allow us to access. Under child info, we see a blue summary hyperlink. This takes us to a summary screen that looks a lot like the review tab when we were entering our initial transaction. Here we can view the child's overall information in one place. We see demographic info, the agency to which the child is involved, siblings, which we'll talk about in a moment, and statuses that have previously been entered. In this case, the only statuses entered are the initial LSI involvement date, the date the child entered care, and the date of the current placement, which is foster care non-kinship. I will click Child Record again to get back to the overview page. We also see as we scroll down the child info window, under siblings, in blue, two siblings. This hyperlink will allow us to look at two sibling records of children who are linked to Bart. Here we see his sisters Maggie and Lisa. By clicking on either of their last names, we would enter their child records. To the right, in the Activities window, there is a blue hyperlink for LSI activities. Clicking this will take us to the LSI activities page, which we saw a little bit earlier, which is where we can go to enter any new LSI activities. Again, that will be covered in Training Module 4. Finally, from the Child Record Overview page, we have some options for starting a transaction/form or making an update. Making an update will allow us to update the agency, the demographics, the sibling information, or the statuses. However, we can only update statuses that we have already entered. Let's try clicking on that. Again, we have the initial LSI date, the date the child entered care, which should not change unless the child goes home, and the date of the current placement. Let's say that Bart's current placement changed. Maybe he is no longer in non-kinship, and maybe he's been moved to a kinship foster home. And let's say that that occurred on July 19th. From this screen, we can make that update and click Save. If we go to Bart's summary screen, we should see that change locked in. Foster care kinship on 7/19. However, what if we need to add an additional status? Maybe Bart has had an initial hearing and there is a primary and concurrent goal. We can't update that status using the make update function because those statuses have not previously been entered. In order to add a new status, we will have to create a new Enter LSI Activities transaction. To do that, we will click the Start Transaction/Form button, and our only option should be to create an Enter LSI Activities transaction. This will take us to the initial info entry section that we saw when we created a new record a short time ago for another child. We can go through the steps here as we did when we were creating a new record, or simply jump to the section that we need to update. In this case, statuses. So by clicking on the statuses tab, I can go directly to the statuses screen. Again, here I see my initial LSI involvement, my date child entered care, and my current placement dates, which have previously been entered. Let's say Bart had a hearing recently and the court established a primary goal of reunification. Perhaps that happened on July 22nd. At that same hearing, a concurrent goal of adoption was ordered, so we can enter those statuses. At the bottom of the page, we'll hit Next. We see our Siblings tab. No changes to make here, so we can again hit Next or go directly to our review screen. And from the review screen, we should see all of our statuses that we have now entered. And again, we will click Next to submit that transaction and save that information. If we click Child Record to go back to Bart's Child Record Overview screen, we can then go to our Make Update button, Statuses, and we will see all of the statuses that we have entered up to this point. So if there was to be a change in the court-ordered goal for Bart, we could simply make that change by using the Make Update button from his Child Record Overview screen. Most of the time, the LSI paralegal will be the first point of contact that the SWAN network has with a child, and it will be your responsibility to create a new record for that child. In the rare instance that you find a child record has been created by somebody outside of LSI within the SWAN network, you will simply need to create an Enter LSI Activities transaction before you're able to interact with that record. From the Child Record Overview screen, simply click Start Transaction Form and select Enter LSI Activities. This will take you to the initial information entry pages, which will likely be filled in with some demographic and basic info. You should update that info to the best of your knowledge and will be required to at least put in a date for initial LSI involvement. Once that transaction has been submitted, you will be able to interact with the child's record as with any other. Linking sibling records and entering LSI activities will be covered in subsequent training modules.